Somewhere in a world on the edge of survival, a small fire flickers, the only light for miles in any direction. Listen closely, and there's almost nothing to hear. No distant voices. No other fires crackling somewhere over the horizon. Just wind and the quiet sound of people trying to stay alive through another night. Around that fire, a handful of people huddle close, sharing warmth against a cold that never seems to end. Beyond the firelight, the world stretches on in silence. No other flame. No other voice, for as far as the eye could see. If you walked for days in any direction, you might not find another living soul. Now ask yourself something unsettling. What if this wasn't just one lonely group, isolated by distance? What if this was almost everyone? If you could count every person left alive on Earth in this moment, the number might shock you. Not millions, not thousands. According to one of the most debated genetic studies in modern science, as few as 1,280 people. Say that number out loud. 1,280. That's not a village. That's not a town. That's smaller than most high schools. And yet, if this number is even close to accurate, every single person alive today, all 8 billion of us, may be descended from this one fragile population. Every argument you've ever had, every language ever spoken, every civilization ever built, all of it tracing back through an unbroken chain of survival to a group of people so small they could have vanished without anyone ever knowing they existed. So how do scientists arrive at a number like this? And more importantly, if humanity really did shrink this small, how did we survive at all? These were the ancestors of a lineage that would eventually split into multiple human species, including the ancestors of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and eventually us. For most of human history, no one knew any of this happened. There were no survivors left to tell the story. No fossils marked danger, no warning passed down. The evidence was hiding somewhere far stranger than any cave or excavation site. It was hiding inside us, encoded in our own DNA, waiting almost 1,000,000 years to be read. In 2023, a team of scientists published a study using a genetic technique called FitCoal, a method that analyzes patterns hidden inside modern human DNA to reconstruct population sizes deep in our evolutionary past. Think of it like reading tree rings, except instead of counting a tree's age, scientists are counting genetic echoes left behind by ancestors who lived hundreds of thousands of years before written history, before pottery, before even fire was fully mastered. And what they found inside that genetic echo was almost too extreme to believe. Their conclusion was staggering. For roughly 117,000 years, the breeding population of our ancestors may have collapsed to somewhere around 1,280 individuals. Not 1,280 total humans who ever lived during that time. 1,280 people alive at any given moment, generation after generation, for over 100,000 years. 117,000 years. Long enough for hundreds of generations to be born, live, and die inside a population that never grew much larger than a modern-day neighborhood. If true, this would be one of the most severe population bottlenecks in the entire story of human evolution. But a number this small raises an obvious question. What could possibly cause a near-total collapse like this? The wind that once carried the scent of open grassland began carrying something else. A deeper, drier cold that didn't retreat with the seasons. Rivers that had flowed reliably for generations began to shrink, some disappearing into cracked, sun-baked earth entirely, leaving behind nothing but dry beds where life used to gather. Forests that had sheltered food, water, and safety began thinning into scattered, isolated patches, islands of green stranded in a spreading sea of dust and exposed rock. Animals that our ancestors depended on for food began migrating, chasing resources that were themselves vanishing, leaving behind silence where herds used to move. This wasn't a single freezing winter. This wasn't a blizzard that passed by morning. This was a prolonged, global climate shift, what scientists call the early middle Pleistocene transition, a period when Earth's climate cycles became longer, harsher, and far less predictable than anything the species had experienced before. Regions that once supported large, connected populations began fragmenting into smaller and smaller pockets of survivable land, islands of life. cut off from one another by hundreds of miles of hostile, unlivable terrain. And this is where the real danger begins. Because when a population fragments like this, something quietly lethal happens. Small, isolated groups become vulnerable in ways large populations never are. A disease that a large population could absorb and survive might wipe out an entire isolated group in a single season. A single bad stretch of failed hunts might mean total starvation, with no larger population nearby to share food, or migrate toward, or fall back on. This is very likely how a once widespread ancestral population became something far smaller and far more fragile, not through one single catastrophe, not through one dramatic ice age straight out of a movie, but through a slow, grinding tightening of the world around them. Year after year, generation after generation. But surviving a changing climate is only half the story. What was it actually like to live through this? Not as a statistic. Day by day, night by night. Fire, by this point in human history, was not new, but it was not guaranteed either. A fire had to be found, protected, fed, and watched constantly, because losing it in a frozen, wind-scoured world could mean death within days. Sleep itself was dangerous. A group spread too far apart risked losing members to the cold, to predators moving unseen in the dark, to the simple, terrifying vulnerability of being unconscious in an unforgiving world. So they stayed close. Bodies pressed together for warmth were also bodies watching for danger. An ancient, unspoken system where someone, almost always, was at least partially alert while the rest slept. Children in a group this small carried an enormous, invisible weight, one no child could have understood. Every child who didn't survive to adulthood wasn't just a personal tragedy. For the people who loved them, it was a genetic dead end, a lineage that would simply stop mid-sentence, forever. Every single day, a population this small, balanced on a blade's edge between continuation and disappearance. And they had no way of knowing which side of that blade they were on. And this is the detail that should stop you. If only a few dozen more unlucky seasons had occurred, a few more failed hunts, a few more harsh winters, a few more diseases sweeping silently through an isolated group, the mathematics of small populations suggest this lineage could have blinked out of existence entirely, quietly, with no one left to notice, and no one left to remember. Every person reading or watching this exists because, generation after generation, that didn't happen. But how solid is this story really? Is this proven science, or an educated guess dressed up as certainty? There's also a puzzling gap between the genetic evidence and the physical evidence in the ground. In some regions, archaeological sites suggest continuous human activity throughout this supposed bottleneck period, stone tools left behind, campsites reused across generations, evidence of populations that don't obviously show a near collapse at all. This doesn't necessarily mean the genetic study is wrong. It's possible the bottleneck was severe in some regions and far less severe in others. It's possible the archaeological record from this period, so ancient, so fragmentary, is simply too sparse, too incomplete to capture population changes this dramatic even if they really happened. Science doesn't always hand us clean, unanimous answers. And any documentary that tells you otherwise isn't being honest with you. What we can say, with real confidence, is this: multiple independent lines of evidence, including patterns of reduced genetic diversity in modern humans, compared to other great apes, do suggest that our species carries the genetic signature of at least one severe ancient population squeeze. The exact size, the exact timing, the exact cause, these are still being debated, argued over, tested against new evidence. But the broad pattern that human ancestors once passed through a genetic bottleneck far more severe than most people realize is taken seriously by much of the scientific community. So if the details are still uncertain, what does any of this actually mean for you? Sitting here, right now, alive. Every instinct you have to seek warmth near others. Every uneasy feeling when you're sleeping completely alone. Every reflex to trust the people closest to you before trusting a stranger. These may be more than habits passed down through culture. They may be inheritances written into you by people who never knew your name and never could have imagined you'd exist at all. And that brings us back to where we started. Not just a group of ancient people trying to stay warm for one cold night. Possibly the entire surviving population of a lineage that would one day become every human being who has ever lived, every name ever spoken, every child ever born, every story ever told. No monuments mark this moment. No name survives for a single person who huddled around that fire. Hands out, breath visible in the cold. There was no way for them to know what they were carrying forward, or how close it came to ending in silence. Unnoticed, unrecorded, gone. Existence, it turns out, was never guaranteed. It was inherited, passed hand to hand, fire to fire, generation to generation, through people who never knew they were the reason anyone would ever exist to ask the question at all.